Biden's first plan to cancel student debt would have been really impactful, but now, 43 million federal student loan borrowers are in limbo period once again. My name is Ayala Chepi. I'm a senior economic policy reporter on the economy team, and I cover student debt. At the end of August in 2022, Biden announced that he would be canceling up to $20,000 in student debt for Pell Grant recipients making under $125,000 a year, and up to $10,000 in student debt for borrowers who are not Pell Grant recipients under that same income cap.
Both of these targeted actions are for families who need it the most. Working and middle-class people hit especially hard during the pandemic.
The court ultimately ruled that Biden's plan was an overreach of authority using the HEROES Act of 2003, a law that basically says that the education secretary can waive or modify student loan balances in connection with a national emergency. Biden used that law to give borrowers financial relief as a result of the pandemic, even though the official national emergency declaration is over. There were two different lawsuits that paused the implementation of Biden's plan, and the court ruled that one of those lawsuits actually did not have standing to sue the Biden administration and its debt relief plan, so they threw the case out. But the second case they found does have standing, and this was filed by 6 Republican-led states who argued that Biden's debt relief would hurt their state's tax revenues and the revenue of a student loan company called Mohila. So the court ultimately ruled that those states did have standing to bring this lawsuit and sue the Biden administration. And it also ruled that the HEROES Act was not the proper law for Biden to use, and that if he wants to try again, he's going to have to take a different legal path. A lot of opponents of the court have argued that the conservative majority is using politics to influence a lot of their decisions. And that especially came to light with, not only the student debt decision, but they're willing to strike down affirmative action. Of course, if we go back to the overturning of Roe v. Wade as well, a lot of opponents have argued that the conservative majority on the court is really consequential in so many major decisions for millions of Americans. That's why we have a lot of Democratic lawmakers, even the Biden administration, who have been saying that the Supreme Court needs to be reformed in some way to ensure that there are not partisan influences driving these decisions that have such huge impact. Just hours after the Supreme Court issued its decision, President Biden and Education Secretary Miguel Cardona announced what's coming next.
Today's decision has closed one path. Now we're going to pursue another.
Essentially, what they said is that they have already begun the process of using the Higher Education Act of 1965 to try again to cancel student debt for millions of borrowers. And what differentiates the Higher Education Act from the HEROES Act, which is what Biden used the first time around, is that it does not require the reliance of a national emergency. However, what's important to note is that using the Higher Education Act is going to take a lot longer than using the HEROES Act. They have begun the process of trying again, but borrowers don't know when they'll be getting relief and if they'll be getting relief during Biden's term. Payments are resuming in October, which means that over 40 million federal borrowers will be entering repayment again without the broad debt relief that they were hoping for. But the Biden administration also announced a 12-month on-ramp period for borrowers once payments resume in October. So that means that if borrowers find that they can't afford these payments when October comes, or they miss payments, their missed payments will not be reported to credit agencies. However, interest will still be accruing once October begins, so the Education Department does recommend that borrowers start making those payments again because their balances will grow if they miss payments. A lot of economists have been predicting that it could be a pretty significant drag on the economy. And that's because when these borrowers are dealing with an additional bill that they haven't been having for over 3 years due to the student loan payment pause, they'll find that they have a lot less money to put into the economy to buy a house, to make those big investments that borrowers have been able to do with the freedom of the payment pause. So it could really limit consumer spending, and it could also potentially stimulate the concerns of a mild recession that economists have been predicting toward the end of this year. Interest is a really big issue that makes borrowers' balances grow far larger than they initially borrowed. And that's because of something called interest capitalization. So even when borrowers are consistent on making their payments every month, interest never stops. Interest always adds on to a borrower's original balance. And that's why you hear of all these really horrible stories of some student loan borrowers who have been paying off their debt for decades and decades, and their balance is sometimes 6 figures more than what they initially borrowed. It's a really big issue that the Biden administration and lawmakers are trying to tackle right now, because that's the primary factor, that borrowers are in a cycle of repayment that they can't get out of due to surging interest rates. So I think there's a lot of anxiety and a lot of concern about what's happening next. And I know that a ton of borrowers are really worried about if they can financially afford to even restart these payments without the debt relief that they were promised.